Good day, good people, and welcome to Contemplative Inner Being. Whether you are here for the live session or watching the recording, thank you so much for being part of our small community. If you will, let me know in the chat section that you can hear me okay. And I believe we have a first-time visitor this evening. Emmy, correct me if I'm wrong, but welcome. We're glad you're here. Just so that everyone knows, these sessions are recorded and they are available on the Mighty Network, and they're also available on YouTube. You're invited to take a moment now to settle in, to be present, to touch that place in your heart where you can listen the deepest. To let the mind quiet. To simply breathe and be. Let each exhale be a letting go of what doesn't serve you right now. A letting go of what you don't need right now. A letting go of the busyness of the day. A letting go of the planning for tomorrow. And let's just rest here in presence for a few moments. Take a gentle breath. Let your breath continue to remind you of the presence that you are as we reflect tonight on the stories from Jesus, the parables, if you will. And we're going to start with some parables from chapter 15 of Luke, where it gives us 3 memorable parables of God's mercy. Jesus tells of the shepherd who rejoices at finding a lost sheep, of the woman who rejoices at finding her lost coin, and of the father who rejoices at the return of his prodigal son. An honest awareness emerges among the parables of lostness about the forms of disorientation that characterize our experience. These stories of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and child present becoming lost as a shared human condition rather than an exceptional failure. This reflection reframes lostness as something that requires acknowledgement rather than shame. When considering the active searching described, assumptions about divine distance lose credibility. Can you imagine the God that's actively searching for you? And notice in the parable of the woman who rejoices at finding her coin that this is a feminine image of God. And these parables assert persistent involvement rather than passive waiting. With this settled truth, comfort arises in knowing that divine attention continues even when desire weakens. And this recognition strengthens trust during times of confusion. Contemplating the idea that God experiences genuine loss clarifies the seriousness of the relationship. This seriousness affirms the value placed on human freedom and presence. Taking in the claim that God remains where lostness occurs actually challenges our long-held preferences for the familiar or safe environments. And this challenge invites movement toward honesty about personal disorientation. When we look at this honestly, it makes resistance visible, especially the resistance to admitting confusion. Confronting that resistance forms deeper openness. Allowing ourselves to be found decreases the pressure to correct our condition independently. In shared commitment, receiving becomes as important as seeking. And as receiving deepens, hope becomes grounded in the constancy of divine initiation. As we reflect on these parables, this will foster the recognition that being found requires consent more than competence. Will you consent to be found by the divine? So this maturing recognition makes grace an experienced reality rather than a concept. In ongoing practice, this reality reinforces humility and strengthens trust, especially when clarity is absent. And friends, this expanding trust makes the path toward restoration feel accessible regardless of current circumstances. So, when we look at the stories of Jesus, Jesus even says in Matthew 13, he's actually quoting Psalm 78, he says, I will speak to you in parables and reveal to you things hidden since the foundation of the world. And then later in Matthew 20, Jesus has a parable about workers in a vineyard. And this is shared to illustrate how God's logic is not like ours. Yeah, an honest recognition arises in our engagement with Jesus' parables about how strongly familiar habits shape our interpretations. We have to be humble and honest to admit that. These stories confront us with the uncomfortable truth that our default mindset tries to control meaning rather than receive something new. Together, we notice how quickly we attempt to measure fairness, reward, and justice according to the cultural norms rather than divine generosity. And the tension becomes obvious in our reactions to the landlord's decision in the vineyard parable. Because instead of accepting the gift, We compare labor, time, and outcome through internal calculations that feel natural but do not reflect the described generosity. Our reflection exposes how tightly we cling to our systems of earning. So when divine justice confronts those systems, our resistance shows a reluctance to trust generosity, especially when generosity is not based on merit. Our shared practice, therefore, demands a willingness to release expectation that God's actions must align with human preferences. And as this willingness grows, it makes a shift possible. In our interior life, claims of deserving begin to dissolve, and gratitude becomes less dependent on perceived fairness. Sitting with this process forms a new steadiness. In our awareness, divine generosity becomes a reality that undermines the instinct to measure worth. This maturing awareness grounds trust, making it less reactive. So friends, in our shared life, this trust encourages a posture of receiving rather than justifying. And that posture makes us more available to the transformation these parables intend. A commitment to this openness allows divine generosity to feel clarifying rather than disruptive. You know, those moments when you say, I just don't get it. And the clarity continues, and it loosens our assumptions, and it allows humility to grow without pressure. You know, can't exhort anyone into humility. Be more humble. So in our relationship with God, by whatever name you use, this humility creates space for genuine change. And that's what story does, is it creates space. That expanding space allows the parables to achieve their purpose, shifting our consciousness toward resilience on divine initiative rather than personal entitlement. Jesus also uses several parables with the image of a wedding banquet. For some reason, in westernized America, we like stories that seem to be more like courtroom or sometimes jail room. But Jesus so often uses the image of a wedding banquet. A clear recognition forms in the presence of the banquet parables about how easily routine responsibilities dominate our attention. Those easy routines. These stories, they challenge us, making acceptance rather than accomplishment the central issue. And our shared reflection makes it evident that busyness often overrides openness. Consider those guests who declined the invitation. That reveals how the everyday nature of their distractions mirrors our own tendencies. No, I've got other things to do than to show up. And so this exposes how rarely we question in our spiritual life whether our commitments support or hinder deeper union. And the widening invitation to include those considered unworthy confronts assumptions shaped by our moral performance. Because in the parables, Jesus is saying, go invite everyone. So this confrontation that confronts our assumptions shaped by moral performance dismantles in our community life the idea that only the qualified belong. It is a continued theme of Jesus for inclusion. When we look at the Jesus stories, we can see that the only thing Jesus ever excludes is exclusion itself. And that continuing dismantling shifts the focus to willingness rather than achievement. Our attempts to respond honestly create discomfort from letting go of categories that divide people into deserving and undeserving. And this surfacing discomfort allows a deeper truth to emerge, that transformation develops through encounter, not through compliance. Certainly not compliance with social expectations. And then there is this instruction given to invite those who cannot repay. And that instruction makes our attachment to reciprocity visible, right? If I invite you to dinner, then sometime in the near future, you have to invite me. So when we can acknowledge this attachment, that clarifies our motivations for generosity. Letting go of reciprocal patterns in our practice requires a deliberate choice to act without expectation, which is part of the definition of love. To give for the goodness of the other without expecting anything in return. So this deliberate choice to act without expectation, as it strengthens, that makes abundance a real orientation rather than an idea. Right? There is more and more and more and more and more available. Jesus isn't very good at dividing up the pie, so to speak, but he always seems to find a way to make the pie so much bigger. And we feel like this former orientation or this shift in orientation frees us from fear of loss. And so generosity begins to flow with greater ease. And as we continue to look at the banquet as a present invitation rather than a distant reward, friends, remaining attentive grows the awareness that the invitation continues regardless of our readiness. In our response, acceptance becomes an act of trust rather than a task to complete. This developing trust brings sincerity and steadiness to our engagement with others. So in our collected life, this steadiness supports a deeper participation in the banquet offered now rather than later. There's no doubt to me that Jesus is continually pointing to that the banquet is happening here if we just learn how to see, right? If we learn how to see generosity, if we learn how to see abundance, if we learn how to see that social expectations are not God's expectations. And when we can see it, heaven is here, not later. This feels like a good place to take a pause, to practice sitting in silence for a few minutes, to commit to our contemplative practice. So continue to be mindful of your breathing. Let go of thoughts. Just let them pass by as clouds. You don't need them right now. They don't serve right now. They're not doing any good right now. Just be present to the presence. Take a gentle breath again. Let yourself relax into just being present. As we continue, Jesus invites us to withdraw our allegiance from a world of bigness and clarity immediacy and looking good and security, and instead to see life as smallness. Try that again. Sorry about that. Friends, Jesus invites us to withdraw our allegiance from a world of bigness, clarity, immediacy, looking good, security. And he wants us to see a life instead as smallness, patience, humility, inner wisdom, and risk-taking. And he has several parables where he's revealing what the realm of God is. In chapter 13 of Matthew, there's several parables on the kingdom of heaven or the realm of God. There are things like seed sown across various soils, the weeds and the wheat, the mustard seed. The stories of a woman mixing a little bit of yeast into 3 batches of flour. He says that the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, or that it's like a merchant looking for fine pearls, or even that it's like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. Friends, to say, "Thy kingdom come," we must say in the next breath, "My kingdom go." There is a direct challenge within the parables of the divine realm that confronts assumptions about power, clarity, and immediate certainty. Reflecting on the seed sown across various soils makes interior resistance to growth visible. This resistance indicates an attachment to familiar structures in our shared examination. So acknowledging this attachment makes patience essential for genuine transformation. The story of the weeds and the wheat reveals the impulse to judge prematurely. Reaction shows that restraint becomes a necessary practice, allowing situations and people to mature in their own time, not just to sort it all out. And then moving to the parables of the tree and the yeast, that clarifies the influence of shared life. Change in our community often develops gradually through relationships and collective commitment. Just like yeast does, right? Reflecting on those parables of treasure and pearl makes the seriousness of desire required for spiritual focus undeniable. And the willingness to relinquish lesser aims in our shared life demands honesty. And then sitting with the final parable makes the rhythm of turning away and returning recognizable. This recognition increases humility through the understanding that conversion continues throughout life rather than just occurring once. It is much more a spiral than a straight line. So friends, embracing the divine realm in our ongoing practice requires releasing personal dominance and accepting an orientation shaped by patience and interior freedom. That kind of strong orientation brings clarity about purpose. And that clarity, in turn, supports a steady willingness to seek what aligns with divine intention rather than the cultural expectation. And our engagement with these parables can become a sustained invitation to live with openness, courage, and sincerity. Most of us are familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke. It may be one of Jesus' most famous parables. And it offers us some compelling signpost of compassion. It does seem that compassion becomes necessary along the path shaped by that parable. The story highlights the way in which we rely on labels. These labels often function as filters that determine who receives our attention. Not that Samaritan, not that bad person, not that dirty person, not that homeless person. And when we can learn how to release those filters, that makes the person that's in need more visible. And so our need or understanding of altruism surfaces our expectations around recognition. I'll be altruistic to that group or this group, but not that group. And so we really have to confront those kinds of expectations. And when we do, that clarifies our desire for approval. And when we can let go of that desire, that shifts compassion toward responsibility rather than image. And doing that makes our motives much more transparent. So remembering the shared heritage between groups and conflicts within the story raises an uncomfortable truth. Right? And that is that close proximity often intensifies division. That observation alone directs us toward examining the similar tendencies within our own communities. Yeah. We become aware of the depth of our attachment to group identity. And the point of the parable is to help make that visible to us. And so to try to set aside those inherited boundaries in our commitment to compassion requires conscious effort. Imagining the Samaritan responding directly to the injured man highlights the cost of real compassion. And so our integrity in the shared life becomes tested. Friends, the parable calls us in our ongoing reflection to consistent presence rather than intermittent charity. And furthermore, it calls us into solidarity instead of charity. I think this is one of the great weaknesses of westernized Christianity, is that it believes that the more that there's charity, the better that they're being. But we have to move beyond seeing our neighbor, beyond preference or similarity. And when we can commit to this, then we have a more reliable the practice of compassion grounded in action. And with all of those parables, I feel like each time that we can return to them and encounter them in different ways, we can come to a place of thanksgiving. We come to a place where we're reminded of the preciousness of all life and its diversity. Because gratitude expands. It can expand to the people and the conditions that quietly sustain our growth. In our shared life, learning rarely comes only from those who resemble us. It often arises through encounters with individuals whose perspectives, histories, and capacities differ in meaningful ways. Because appreciation comes to a place where it takes on a more grounded form, one that honors difference rather than merely acknowledging it. Think about it. And you really don't have to think about it long, how quickly comfort can narrow our view. How quickly comfort can draw us toward familiar voices while overlooking those whose experiences stretch our understanding. And when we can recognize this pattern, we find gratitude shifting toward a discipline that keeps us receptive to challenge, to correction, and new ways of seeing. And there is hopes for community that's shaped by equity. And doing that will bring about questions about access and privilege into sharper focus. Friends, in our collective discernment, the desire for justice requires more than intention. It demands attention to the ways social, economic, and historical conditions influence opportunity. So when we can engage those realities, that will connect gratitude to responsibility. And in our spiritual life, this responsibility includes care for the land and water. Recognizing the stability of all living beings depends on honoring these shared sources of life. And then relationships, another dimension opens as we acknowledge the sacredness of each person's story. In our encounters, listening becomes an act of reverence. It's an act of reverence that allows the presence of the divine to surface through ordinary experience. And when you learn to listen like that, and that listening deepens, assumptions lose their authority, and a clearer understanding of one another begins to form. So I hope you'll share in that commitment, because our shared commitment to this understanding fosters humility and strengthens bonds grounded in mutual respect. And through the continued practice of this way of relating that Jesus is teaching through the parables, through the stories from Jesus, that just allows gratitude to grow into a steady orientation that shapes how we see, how we respond, and how we participate in the wider community. Well, friends, I think that may be enough reflection for this evening. I thank you for being here and your participation in your presence. I hope you found something meaningful. Let me give a moment or two for if anyone has anything to say in the chat. It's been very quiet tonight. Anything at all? Question, comment, maybe you just want to say hi to each other. Again, Emmy, thank you for being here. It's good to see you. See, there are a couple of people typing, so I'll wait. Okay. Thank you, Ida. Thank you for being here. Friends, as we draw to a close this evening, may trust deepen as divine generosity, persistent attention, transforming encounter, and courageous compassion continue to shape our shared life. May openness to being found, to receiving what is offered, and to offering ourselves without calculation guide our movement into greater freedom. And may humility, responsibility, and sincerity anchor our steps as we walk forward in the presence of the one who accompanies every moment. Blessings to all. I hope to see you again soon. Good night.